Well, everyone, my name is Rachel Moran, and I'm going to moderate this panel. That's a distinct pleasure, given that I previously served as director, and it's fabulous to see the Graduate Fellows program is still thriving and nurturing so many emerging talents. This panel is on street, school, work, sites of organizing, and illegality, and we thought we would, instead of following alphabetical order, follow the order of street, school, and work. And so we're going to start with Victor Rios, who is an associate professor of sociology at UC Santa Barbara. He has a 2011 book, Punished: Policing the Lives of Black and Latino Boys. And he has published widely. He has been a recipient of a number of awards, including the Harold J. Plouse Award at UC Santa Barbara. And in 2010, he received the Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Mentoring Undergraduate Research, paying forward some of the mentoring he got here at the Institute. He's a native of Oakland. He received his PhD in Ethnic Studies from UC Berkeley, where he was a graduate fellow here at the Institute from 2004 to 2006. He later came back and worked on a team looking at preventing youth violence. So I had the pleasure of working with him during my directorship. Victor, take it away.
Okay, so I want to talk about a legacy right here of the ISSC, studying the whole, crossing institutional settings and public scholarship. Of course, you know, this was reinforced in ethnic studies and the area I'm trained in. I am in sociology at UC Santa Barbara, but for the record, I pretend to be a sociologist so that I could make a paycheck, okay? Don't get it twisted. In America's Working Man, David Hale employed qualitative researchers to study the whole. Our objects of analysis, Hale figured, should not be small bits of people's circumscribed routines, work, family, religion, but people's lives in their entirety. Right? And this is going to be an important point about the legacy here at ISSC. Unfortunately, Hale's call generally has been unheeded. Qualitative researchers have been more than content to write about people only in a particular place, street corner, particular capacity, the job role. This is doubly true of poverty researchers, criminologists, and students of social marginality, right? So in 1984, Hale saying, let's cross institutional settings, a call that other disciplines have been good at heeding and at following through with, but it just hasn't happened in sort of one of my sub-areas. So for me, studying the whole is crossing institutional settings. I'll get into that in a minute here. So my research agenda is looking at the role of social control in determining the well-being of young people living in urban marginality, tracking the social consequences of the punitive state and punitive social control across institutional settings, and looking at young people's resilience and response to social marginalization. My 2011 book was heavily influenced and actually has lots of editing from people that directed, worked for, and continued to support us at the ISSC. So I really think that this work wouldn't have been produced hadn't it been for that influence, the final touches that individuals at the ISSC provided for me. So there's collateral consequences of mass incarceration in the lives of marginalized young people. There's a systematic stripping of dignity. I'll get back to dignity in a minute. There's criminal justice discourses, practices, policies, and resources that are embedded in other institutions. Your colleague here, my great colleague too, Jonathan Simon, writes about this, governing through crime. Punishment becomes a social fabric of everyday life. Young people are marked prior to committing crime. So Diva Patriot writes about how people are marked with a criminal justice record. I write about how people are marked before they even get a criminal justice record. And there's a paradoxical resistance that the very system that is sort of displacing, pipelining young people from school to prison is the very system that is raising a certain kind of oppositional consciousness in young people. And so when the sort of Occupy Wall Street people march around and they hold up banners and say, you know, more jobs or forgive my student loans. You see young people from the inner city holding up signs that say stop police brutality because, you know, yeah, I need a job, but first I need police to stop cracking my head open with a baton. So Tyrell's too tall. He's one of the young men in the study. In 5th grade, he's harassed by police for being too tall. I asked him, what do you mean by that? He says, well, you know, I got stopped by police a lot of times. I asked him, officer, well, why are you stopping me? He says, I'm only in 5th grade. The officer says, well, you know, you're too tall to be in 5th grade. You look like a drug dealer. 6th grade, his teacher calls the police on him. 8th grade, he decides to sell drugs, is arrested. He says, if I'm going to be treated as a criminal, I might as well reap the benefits. His mother's evicted from public housing, becomes addicted to crack cocaine. And I recorded 21 police stops in 3 years in the time I was in the field with him. I'm not talking about the other times when I wasn't there. I wish I could talk more about Tyrell, but only gave me 15 minutes. So my themes in my research, or in this particular case study, young people are marked prior to committing a crime. They're pushed into jumping. Some of you will know that sort of term from McLeod's work. There's a meshing of the punitive arm of the state with the nurturing arm of the state. Here we have Loic Wauquant's influence. You know, he always holds up his right hand and he says, what happens when the right arm of the state has, you know, taken over the left arm of the state? But he says it a lot more eloquently than I can. There's the under-policing, over-policing paradox that I find. We'll talk about that later. And there's images. Here's a picture of a youth taking a picture of a cop, taking a picture of him. In a photo voice project, this is an ISSC idea that developed, photo voice. Then my students, some of them who have become graduate students here at Berkeley, have helped me out with. One of them who's present here today, Amy Martinez. And then young people just taking images of being harassed. This is a field trip. We took these 3 boys to UC Santa Barbara for a field trip, and the UCSB police officer, stopped them, stripped their shirts off to check for gang tattoos. We told him he was with they were with us, and he didn't care. This just more images of young people out in my other field study, my new field study. So one of the things I wanted to comment on in terms of the sort of influence that I received here at the ISSC is that institutions influence people. So I was influenced by, this institution, but there's certain people that make institutions. And for me, right, we had a lot of great mentorship from different people, but one of the people that really left a mark on my work is, of course, David Minkus. So with that influence, right, I was able to develop a project that the discipline now, sociology and to an extent other disciplines, are acknowledging as a new way of understanding inner city young people. And I'll get into some of that with dignity, right? So typically, right, the urban ethnography on young men of color in particular are that it's kind of racialized, right? It's about honor and respect. Somehow the Latino males are about honor, and somehow the black boys are about respect. It's an assertive stance. It's about being power hungry. It's sort of, Al Young has said that this kind of alludes us to this understanding that the streets determine all their values and codes of conduct. That these are compensatory behaviors, fixed typologies. And the way I've been looking at it is that it's a more basic, fundamental human sort of need. And that's that universal need to be acknowledged as a fellow human being. Goffman called this a positive right? That I expect you in my interaction with you to treat me as a fellow human being. This is about a sense of humanity. self-willed, socially conscious being, what Fanon would call it. It's a more basic principle. It's about human acknowledgement. And so we see culture as more fluid, more dynamic. In the new work titled Missing Fire, Gangs Across Institutional Settings, I talk about how within a day, right, a young person who's caught up in the street life can drift between being street life oriented and even being school oriented, depending on the institutional influence and the cultural heterogeneity that they experience, and that's embodied and embedded in the neighborhood context, as your colleague here, David Harding in sociology, would talk about. So I've gotten in trouble for talking about beyond the Jungle Book trope, because I talk about how, in urban ethnography, how, people like Sudhir Venkatesh might go out and say, I met the wild people, and I got to know them, and they actually even rescued me, and I lived to tell about it. And so America, these people aren't so bad after all, right? This classic sort of trope in, right, this hegemonic sort of discipline and subdiscipline about studying those wild people and coming back to tell America, to translate for them, for America, that these people aren't so bad after all. And just 2 days ago, Alice Goffman was in the New York Times with her new book, which actually I think follows, tries really hard, I think, to really follow a new tradition about looking at the state and power, but the way in which she's prominently sort of celebrated can be troublesome as well. We'll talk about that later. I'll play a clip. These young boys, these coming back to Oakland, their friend had done this to a cop, and the cop ended up shooting and killing him. So they helped with this action, right? Oakland police wanted for murder. Here we're talking about resistance.
This is the real crummy. I don't think it's karma or nothing. I just think they just doing their job. Like, police get too comfortable with just like jacking people. Like, they too comfortable with just thinking they can get their way. They gotta get back on people how they been doing it. Like, feel me? Like, when you go pull up on somebody, you gotta come with your guns out. They too comfortable thinking they too hard, just walking up, and they gonna get shot. Like, you ain't no telling what he had. He could have had.
I don't think it's revenge or nothing. I just think that people is fed up with the police and how they be acting. So, you feel me? They ain't finna be having that really like that no more. They ain't been tolerating that. They feel if you need some protection, you could just protect yourself. Why would you need somebody else?
That's just like the police. How they discriminate black people, anybody black to wear hoodies and stack their pants and got goatees, sell dope, rob people and shit like that, when it's really not like that. You know what I'm saying? It just, the goatee and shit just like that. It's just a style. Everybody that got lower their pants or any little thing. But I mean, I ain't gonna speak on them. I'm speaking towards the black perspective, right? But I understand they treat the Mexicans the same way. They treat the Mexicans the same way. They all affiliated in gangs. They feel all Mexicans affiliated in gangs. You know what I'm saying? Fucking with toys. All the same way they discriminate black.
And man, one more thing, man. Rest in peace, Oscar Grant, man. Rest in peace, the nigga that shot the police, man. On the real, man. Fuck police, man. I see you later.
There's that paradoxical resistance I was talking about, and the key point here is that there's a collective racialization, criminalization process. So young people, race is being constructed, right, where they used to battle with each other. Now they're coming together to sort of battle with a common enemy. So, and in the end, right, the influence of the ISSC has even sort of had me come up with ideas, practical ideas, this public scholarship, and talking to police departments or school districts about implementing restorative justice, and really pushing this idea of dignity enhancement as crime suppression, as dignity enhancement should be our focus, that young people are not at risk, but that they're at promise, because what you label someone ultimately determines how you will treat them. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you, Victor. And now we're going to hear from Genevieve Negrón-Gonzales, and she is an assistant professor in the School of Education at the University of San Francisco. She grew up on the U.S.-Mexico border, and she has been involved in social justice work around immigrant rights and educational justice since she was a teenager. She earned her PhD at Berkeley in social and cultural studies and education in 2011. And I just missed you because I think we had the selection process and then I ended my term and you began shortly thereafter. But I'm going to be so pleased to hear about your work. Thank you, Genevieve.
Fingers crossed. Right. I'm always a little bit surprised when it works correctly. Thank you so much for all of you being here today. It's really, really such an honor to be back at ISSC in the company of many familiar faces and in a place and in a moment to honor a place for me at UC Berkeley that was really my intellectual home when I was here. I worked almost full time and I had 2 children when I was in graduate school here at UC Berkeley. And so I navigated a lot of places in which I had to really position myself so that I would be taken seriously as a scholar. Given those things, I was assumed to be not serious about my scholarship. And at ISSC, I was taken seriously from the very beginning, and that's something I'll always be really grateful for. So my talk today is titled Neoliberalism, Illegality, and Undocumented Community College Students. And what I'd like to do today is to share some preliminary findings from some ongoing research that I'm conducting right now in California Central Valley. And I'm very indebted to Sarah Ramirez, who spoke earlier today, who gave you the context for the Valley. Because of the time limits, I had to basically chop all of that out of my talk. So I'm very grateful that she set this up so well for me. All right. So I've been working with, supporting, and researching undocumented students in California for about the last 8 or 9 years. This is work that I incubated while I was here at ISSC as a research fellow. And so as we jump into this conversation, let me identify sort of 3 really important context points as an entry point into the conversation that I want to have today. So the first context point is that the political terrain around undocumented students and access to higher education has really shifted very dramatically in the last several years. Right? We've seen major shifts in terms of legislative changes, specifically in California, in the form of things like AB 131 and 131, the California DREAM Act, and on a federal level, DACA, which have really helped create a smoother entry into higher education for undocumented students. Not an easy path, but a smoother entry, more accessibility. The second point of context is that this shift has really occurred in very significant part as a result of the really brave and daring work led by undocumented student activists on the ground, right? The third point of context is that despite the best efforts of these students, the conversation around undocumented students and access to higher education has really continued to remain around and focused on promising students who are at the top of their class, who are stellar model students at four-year universities and urban centers. Right? The conversation, despite the urging of the undocumented students themselves in many cases, the conversation has really stayed trained on that sort of segment of the population. So as someone who's been thinking about this over the past 8 or so years, someone who's seen this trajectory shift, right, the political terrain shift itself broadly, the evolution of the undocumented student activists individually, I began to think about the ways in which a shifting political terrain has to then, for activist scholars, right, like ISSC trains us to be, how it has to also then shift the kinds of questions that we're asking, right? And so in this, I decided that I needed to focus on the undocumented students who were being left out of the debate, right? Focus on the undocumented students who are not the model students at big flagship four-year universities, undocumented students who are not in big metropolitan centers, undocumented students who may actually be experiencing this moment of legislative opening as a moment of closing, right? And so this is how I came to focus on the research that I'm currently doing, looking at students who are marginalized both because of their educational trajectory as well as because of their geographical location. So these are community college students, not four-year university students, and they're located in the Central Valley, right? Not in Berkeley, at UC Berkeley or at UCLA. So I came into this study really wanting to understand the experiences of undocumented community college students in the Valley and understanding how this experience, how they were experiencing the changing political terrain, right? Were they experiencing this as a moment of opening or not, and in what ways was that happening? This is a qualitative ethnographic study that draws principally on interviews with undocumented community college students in the Central Valley, but to a lesser extent it also draws on some participant observation and some interviews with community college faculty and staff members. And this is research that I'm still working on. So what I want to talk about today is a couple of the preliminary findings, some of the emergent themes that are coming out of this research that's still ongoing. As I said, Sarah Ramirez gave us a really great overview of the Valley earlier, which I'm grateful for because I don't have time to talk about it a lot right now. But life in the Valley, as we know, really centers on agriculture, right? And the agricultural industry centers on undocumented migrant labor, right? Documented migrant labor as well, but undocumented migrant laborers are very uniquely positioned in sort of the economic structure of the Valley and the agricultural industry. The students in this study then are for the most part the children of these migrant workers, right? Many of them actually are laborers themselves. They're either have very recently worked in the fields or they continue to work in the fields as they also attend community college in the Central Valley, right? These are extremely low income students. We're talking about students and families where the conversation about if there's going to be enough resources within the family unit to put food on the table is an active question on a daily basis. Right? They are, for the most part, managing full-time or more than full-time work along with their community college load. They're all first-generation college students. So I really went into this research looking for the policy story. I wanted to know how they were experiencing, navigating, benefiting or not from these recent policy changes. However, in that process, another story began to emerge, and this is the story that I want to focus on today. It's a story that's connected to, but it's also deeper than and broader than just these legislative shifts. It's the story of the intersection between neoliberalism, higher education, and undocumented students. And this is what I'd like to focus on today, right? How this intersection tells a very unique story about what's at stake in this moment of higher education. And what I'm contending then is that the neoliberalization of higher education is critically undermining the fundamental function of the community college system in relation to the California Master Plan, right? And that's illuminated by looking at the experiences of undocumented students in the system. The reason to me that this is so important is because I think that these findings directly contradict the stories that we tell about the community college system, the imagination that we have about the community college system, that it's affordable, that it's accessible, and that it could create a pathway for marginalized students into four-year university. So before I go much further on, let me talk a little bit about the definition of neoliberalism that I'm drawing on in this work. So Henry Giroux talks about neoliberalism as a political, economic, and social project that construes profit-making as the essence of democracy, consuming as the only operable form of citizenship, and an irrational belief in the market to solve all problems and to serve as a model for structuring all social relations. So when we're talking about neoliberalism, we're talking about profit, we're talking about consumption, and we're talking about market rule or market logic. So when we think about, I'm going to share sort of two emergent themes that are coming from this. So one of them relates to access. When we think about the way that neoliberalization impacts access to higher education, there are some key facts that emerge, right? And these will be of no surprise to anybody who is in school in California right now, especially in the public system, right? We know that one, tuition continues to skyrocket, right? We know that two, financial aid is decreasing. And then we know that three, that as a result of that, student debt is exploding. And there's a lot of really, really great scholars who are working on this question of sort of the explosion of student debt and what that means for the future of this country, essentially, right? But what I also found is that in this context, right, as a result, access to the private lending market, the ability to take out private loans, is necessary to finance a college education. And so what I found then is that precarious legal and employment standing excludes undocumented migrant students from the private lending sphere, thereby creating a sometimes impermeable barrier to enrolling in even the lowest cost rung of public higher education in the state of California. Okay. These students don't have bank accounts, they don't have credit, they don't have collateral, they don't have co-borrowers, they don't have co-signers, right? They don't have lending histories. They have profoundly risky credit profiles. And so what I'm finding is that despite even these really important legislative changes that have been set up to financially assist undocumented students, and they are important, they are meaningful, right? That even despite these, the broader process of privatization creates an impermeable barrier to even accessing this very lowest cost rung of the higher education system. So to illustrate this point, I'm going to share a quote from a young woman named Avelina, who is sharing with me the struggles that she's had in financing her community college education. She says, the financial aid counselor told me I'd have to take out loans. And I'm like, I can't. She says, nobody wants to, but it'll be fine. I said to her, I don't have anybody to co-sign. My parents work in the fields. She acted like I didn't want to make it work. But like, there's no bank account because there's no money. I don't even have the $12 to get a student ID. Who's going to give me a loan? So again, what this means is that meaningful policy can only go so far in creating an equitable path to higher education, because this policy is being enacted within the context of deep, persistent intergenerational poverty mapped onto the context of illegality, right? In an increasingly privatized context, students who must rely on the public are unable to gain entry. The second theme that emerges is about the way that neoliberalization stratifies support. So one of the hallmarks of neoliberalization more broadly is that there's a slashing of support services, of social services, right? And in higher ed, we can see this as a very clear example of this context. We see that programs that we know that have been proven to be critically important for the success of marginalized students and first-generation students, we see these programs being cut, defunded, collapsed, or very frequently being asked to accomplish more and more and more with less and less and less resources. What I found, though, is that in speaking with undocumented students, it appears that there's another way in which neoliberalism is shaping the kind of support that happens on community college campuses in the Valley. So student support services are being subjected to a neoliberal evaluative logic. And in this logic, a return on investment comes to be seen as more important than student development as a necessary aim and attempt of these projects. So what I found is that support services are pushed to prioritize which students to support, right? And they must reserve scarce resources for students who they think will make it out. And not surprisingly, undocumented students don't fare very well in that calculation. These are students who are seen as not likely to be successful, right, by all typical and traditional measurements. So what I mean by this is that under this neoliberal logic, what ends up happening is that staff are forced to make predictions about where to deploy resources, right? And when you look at a population that are first-generation college students, that come from farm-working families, that are migrant laborers themselves, their paths to higher education are marked by fits and stops, right? They go to school one semester, they don't have enough money to enroll in the subsequent 2 semesters. They're not seen to be a safe bet. It's not assumed that they're going to make it out. And so a really great example of this, a really terrible example of this, is an example of a young woman who I spoke with named Eliana. And Eliana talks about her entry into the community college system in the Valley in 2 separate moments. So first of all, she first entered as a high school graduate. She had a stellar GPA in high school. So when she enrolled in the community college, she was immediately invited to be part of the honors program at the community college. What it meant for her to be in the honors program is that she was given a specialized guidance counselor, she was given academic support services, she was given tutoring services, a whole series of wraparound services that are given to promising students in the honors program. She had a stellar first semester, she got a 4.0, and then the next semester she didn't have enough money to enroll in college again. right? As a result, she worked more than full-time at her fast food job. She saved for 8 months, and she came back to re-enroll in the following fall, right? So she was enrolled in the fall, off for the spring, came back the following fall, was excited about coming back to school. She came back and she found that she'd been kicked out of the honors program. The reason that she'd been kicked out of the honors program is because participation in the honors program is contingent on continuous enrollment, right? Which means that because she had withdrawn, she was no longer given access to her counselor. She no longer had access to the support services. She no longer had access to all of the things that made her have such a strong semester in the fall. Eliana says, and it just really sucked, you know? I already felt ashamed about not being able to afford school last semester, and then I felt like they were saying that because I had made that choice, it's like it proved to them I wasn't serious about my studies. I went from being an honor student that my counselor was proud of to a student that had to wait 3 weeks to even see a counselor. She was the same kid. But at the start, she's seen as having the potential to succeed. And just a short time later, when she's no longer seen as having that same potential, she's no longer deserving of the kind of support services that we know help students achieve. I got you, I'm gonna wrap up. So what we're seeing then is two critical functions, right? We see that neoliberalization is fundamentally undermining the central function of the community college system, right, as an entry point into higher education for marginalized students. And we're also seeing that despite legislative openings for some undocumented students, not all undocumented students are being able to benefit from this moment of legislative opening because of the grip of poverty and the context of illegality within this neoliberal order. I draw on the work of the late Stuart Hall. Whoa, his name got a little crazy. I draw on the work of the late Stuart Hall, who says, the university is a critical institution, or it is nothing. And to me, this is what's at stake here, right? This is what's at stake, is that within the context of neoliberalism, deeply marginalized students are being even further marginalized, right? There is a deeper bifurcation. There is a further widening of the gap. And in that context, I see Hall's statement as a call to action for us. I think we need to ask ourselves, how do we use our foothold in the university to make sure that the university is a critical institution and that it doesn't just serve as an institution that's set up to sustain and maintain the status quo? Thank you.
Well, we have now heard about how the street can divert you from school. We've learned about school as an uncertain path to upward mobility. And now we're going to hear from Jennifer Chun, who is Associate Professor in Sociology and Director of the Center for the Study of Korea at the University of Toronto. And her research looks at the globalization of labor and the lives of those who are at the bottom rungs of the global labor market. She has written a book, which was published in 2009 by Cornell University Press, called Organizing at the Margins, The Symbolic Politics of Labor in South Korea and the United States. It won the American Sociological Association's Race, Gender, and Class Section Award. You were a co-winner of that award. And in addition, she's had a very long affiliation with the Institute, having been a graduate fellow here before I arrived, and continuing her association as her partner was a graduate fellow here. So we're really, really pleased to have you back, Jennifer.
Great, thanks, Rachel. So it is my honor to close out such an inspiring, stimulating, and nourishing day. I want to thank Deborah and Christine for just the amazing hard work that went into organizing this conference, keeping us fed, keeping us hydrated, keeping us caffeinated, but also giving us something to look forward to after my talk and after this panel. Also, I wanted to thank Troy and all the directors that came afterwards for remaining really committed to the Institute and the space, and it's really amazing to be able to come back to a place like this after many years. I think it's really fitting that a day that is meant to honor the work of David Minkus over 3 decades at the Institute has brought me in the company of this really fantastic panel, and also in conversation with many old friends and colleagues and new ones that I continue to feel energized by, humbled by, but also learn a tremendous amount from. It's definitely worth the cross-border trip, because every time I come back, I have to cross the border and I have to deal with customs. But of course, I think, anytime the Institute would ask for something, I would certainly come, because as many others have said, the Institute was that place for me, that place of refuge, that place of belonging that really allowed you to feel whole in graduate school, which didn't always really offer that experience. But also it was a place of critical engagement, and I have so many good memories of walking into the Institute and seeing Janice, and then getting into like a heavy, heated conversation with Minkus, where he really pushed me and I'm sure many others to develop our ideas and to think kind of beyond the conventional frameworks. I may not have always listened to David's advice, but it always meant a great deal to me that I could walk into the Institute and know that he was an ear that he could offer a supportive and critical ear. Okay. So since my days at Berkeley and at the Institute, my research interests have evolved and shifted in different ways. I remain primarily committed to understanding the nexus between labor migration and capitalism, and as Rachel said, primarily for workers employed on the bottom rungs of the labor market, and in particular, really trying to understand intersections between race, class, and gender for this group of workers. But I think one of the things that happened after I finished my book and left Berkeley was I came to be involved in a long-term collaboration with Young Shin and Asian immigrant women advocates, which is based in Oakland and also San Jose, and it is a kind of organization that I also invested a lot of time and energy to when I was here. And so given the themes of the conference, I thought it would be really valuable to focus on this collaboration that I've been doing with AWA, to talk about some of the findings that we have developed, but also some of the opportunities and dilemmas of engaging in activist scholarship. Okay, so about AWA. So for those of you who don't know, AWA, Asian Immigrant Women Advocates, was established in 1983, first in Oakland, Chinatown, and then in San Jose in the South Bay. And there are 2 core constituencies that AWA was committed to. Chinese and Korean immigrant women, earlier that worked in the factories, in garment, electronics, in restaurants, but as manufacturing has declined, they are more likely to work in kind of low-paid, precarious service work as home care workers, hotel workers, and cafeteria workers. AWA's mission is very clear. It is committed to empowering their 2 core constituencies to be their own advocates of change. And so I think this is really important because while since AWA, there's been a kind of explosion of worker centers, and many people call them these hybrid centers that combine community organizations and unions. But I think what's really important is that AWA's legacy and genealogy is committed to empowering a particular ethnic community group, and it's very much based in the kind of movement community of Oakland and the Bay Area, which has been influenced by the racial justice movement, but also by radical Asian American politics. So during graduate school, I worked as a volunteer and later as a part-time staff worker at the organization. And it's interesting because one of the first kind of my MA research project was a shop floor ethnography, where I ended up kind of working in the Silicon Valley and in one of these manufacturing factories, because I taught Korean immigrant women manufacturing workers English through AWA's workplace literacy program. But rather than, I think, focus on that area, my work veered into kind of comparative labor movement organizing in Korea and the US. And so it was more like I lived parallel lives. I had my kind of dissertation and academic work, and then I had the kind of political commitments and the organizing that I would do at AWA. And it was only until after I left Berkeley that Yang Shin, the executive director, approached me and said we should work together on a project about AWA. And as AWA was approaching its 25th anniversary at the time, Yang really wanted to figure out, well, she really thought it was time for a reflexive self-study. She thought it was time for the organization to really take a step back and figure out, after over 2 decades of organizing, what worked, what didn't, and why. And I think, for Yang, it was more than just documentation and evaluation. She really kind of saw it as a critical moment. She felt that it was time for a paradigm shift. Even though many community organizations at the grassroots level really embraced and prioritized the need to engage in this kind of social change work, she felt that there were few organizations that were really committed to it. And she really wanted to understand why, and she really wanted to kind of still stimulate conversations around this. So we did a variety of things: focus groups, key informant interviews, action research, all kinds of things to really kind of root the research in, I think a lot of questions, both that we could ask to its members, but also to ally groups about AWA's approach to community organizing. And I want to just share 3 of the key findings. The first one is that organizational priorities shape organizational forms. I think during the first phase of the study, what was really important for me to understand was, even though many organizations really promote the importance of grassroots community organizing, why do so few really do it? And so I wanted to understand why AWA was so committed to this model of social change. And what's interesting is that it was a really conscious and purposive decision. Even though its mission was like this, I think for those of you who are around in the mid-90s, AWA became embroiled in one of the, a really high-profile anti-sweatshop campaign for 2.5 years between 92 and 95. And that's actually how I came to know AWA as an organization. And it was really a successful, massive boycott. This is kind of before the days of Kathy Lee Gifford and kind of all the kind of sweatshop campaigns. And I think what was important, it was high profile, it was public shaming, but it really mobilized a second generation Asian American community to really pay attention to the kinds of exploitative sweatshop labor practices that happened in the global garment industry. But what's interesting is that this brought AWA, a very small organization, into a state of a lot of national recognition. It attracted a lot of interest from students, from activists, from researchers. But I think as AWA was winding down from this very kind of intensive campaign that they launched with 5 people, some members of the organization started wondering, where do we go from here? And can we go to a moment where we can have a high-profile kind of policy impact campaign where we can really kind of build on these successes, or, to what extent do we really need to remain committed to our mission? And at the time, I think there was a desire to think about what it meant for an organization to stay committed to a grassroots community organizing mission, to go beyond defensive campaigns, public negotiations, and strategic negotiations that often left its members out of the negotiating table. And what did it mean to really get back to its core priorities? And to recognize that if you were to engage in grassroots community organizing, you really had to understand what Paletta calls a more complex equality, in which different skills, talents, and interests are seen as equally valuable. Which really meant, even though Asian immigrant women workers worked in low-paid jobs, that they couldn't speak English, that there were many practical reasons why they couldn't be at the table, this was still something worth committing to. What's interesting to me at the time was that for AWA, it was a real rejection of scaling up. And if anyone of you knows foundation speak, all of the talk right now is about scaling up. But the organization decided to focus inwards, not outwards. by trying to integrate its priorities, its mission, with its program activities. And I think this was a contested decision, and they lost staff over it, but the organization and the executive director was really committed to this. So out of this kind of moment of thinking about where AWA goes in its post-campaign life, it had a series of strategic planning meetings and came up with this CTOS chart, the Community Transformational Organizing Strategy. There's no time to get into this very, very complex chart, but this is after a series of discussions about how in fact they would link their programs at different levels with really giving their members the skills, the knowledge, and the experience to become their own advocates for social change. And I just wanted to show another one. This is the less kind of graphically nice version, but it, they adapt and change it over the time. They're just constantly trying to modify their model. I think when you invest in trying to develop grassroots leadership and to really recognize that members come with different skills, different experiences, and also different sets of sensibilities, what it really led me and also some of my co-authors, George Lipset and Young Shin, to recognize is that CTOS was really about trying to operationalize how empowerment works in an intersectional context. In other words, it's really easy to say, give voice to the voiceless, we need to think about how to promote agency, but how do you actually do it? And how do you do it for women workers' lives that occupy multiple sets of oppressions and multiple kind of arenas of subordination? And so CTOS was really about thinking about intersectionality as a social movement strategy, about allowing women to envision how a series of steps, for example, how the decision to take an English language class or a health and safety workshop or learning about the histories of racial exclusion might result in a transformation in their own lives. And I just want to talk really briefly. This is a campaign that happened. It was kind of going from defensive to proactive in the sense that AWA members, these are former garment workers, but also some women who never worked in the garment industry, that really collaborated with University of San Francisco health officials and also public health professionals and city officials to design a model garment workshop, and then also to kind of have this quirky ergonomic chair library. And I think some people might, question, how is this impactful? But what's really important is that, these AWA leaders trained hundreds of women to not just be the victims of chronic repetitive stress injury as garment workers, but to use that embodied knowledge to actually flip the kind of the narrative and become experts and become the ones that were teaching public health professionals, teaching their employers, and also educating city council officials about what it would take to really invest in the health and bodies of immigrant women workers. So the third thing I want to say is a little bit more, I've been grappling with this right now, which is I think that this kind of investment in grassroots community organizing and leadership development is incredibly time and resource intensive. And there's a whole, if you could talk to Young Shin and Awa, she's here, she'll tell you about the database that they've developed, the programmatic work that they've done to really try to link their mission and activities. But one thing I think that's really clear is that this kind of investment in grassroots leadership has come at a cost. And all of us know that many community organizations are operating in the context of fiscal austerity, of shrinking resources. And so what's been happening, at least from what I can see, is that this investment in its CTOS model and its grassroots leadership has also undermined some of the strategic capacity of the organization. In other words, by really staying committed to its mission, reorganizing its organization to really walk the walk, not just talk the talk, it has also had to sacrifice other things. And by strategic capacity, I'm thinking a bit about Marshall Ganz's work, where he talks about what's really important about organizers in the movement is that they have the ability to adapt to external constraints, to changing conditions and opportunities, and that often takes a level of skill and expertise that may not always be available to a grassroots constituency. Okay, so I want to close by sharing some of the dilemmas that I have been experiencing. And I think in many ways I feel very grateful to be able to share these and to think through these problems with you. You know, Troy started off the day saying that social change is painful. And I feel like this next iteration of the research is feeling a little bit more painful. Because instead of really profiling what an organization does, I'm trying to critically evaluate the costs and benefits of it. And I think, you know, I teach an article by Nancy Shepherd Hughes called Iron in Ireland, where, you know, the Irish villagers ran her out of town after she read the ethnography. And I think about that because it's much easier to just do work and then never think about it again. Never have to face the people that you talk to, never really have to think about the consequences of that research. And I feel like, you know, working with AWA on this project has really put me in to deal with those dilemmas in a really real way. So I think that, you know, where I'm at right now is how does the research support a vision of social change, a vision and practice of social change that is undervalued and also devalued. And what I mean by that is that it seems like in this context of limited resources, the investment in grassroots leadership has been framed as an either-or choice. I don't think it's a real choice, but I think it's certainly a choice that makes sense. And what really matters is the policy impacts, what really matters is the scaling up, and ironically, there's no way to really value the kind of individual level transformation that poor and marginalized peoples face. And I also think about something that Troy said earlier about science, right? It's not scientific if it occurs on the outside, but I think in social change research or policy research, it's not impactful if it happens in the inside. And so that's something that I've been really dealing with. And so I think what AWA is trying to do, and also the kind of path that we're on together, is what does it mean to go against the grain, to go beyond a narrow emphasis on policy impacts, and also prioritizing this question, what does justice, dignity, and belonging look like for the poor and the marginalized, instead of constantly interrogating what's impactful. And I think the need for critical communities, for good conversation and good practice is essential to helping me work through these dilemmas. So thank you.
We're now happy to take questions for any one of our panelists on these wonderful topics about street, school, and work. Anybody? Yes. Wait till, let's get you the microphone first.
I'd like to ask Victor, do you see any change over time in what's going on in the area where you've been studying? Santa Barbara, I guess? Policing, police response to youth.
So, I think that, okay, do I see any change in the way that young people are policed over time? There is a big push for restorative justice, and I think the pendulum is swinging really slow. I have hope that it'll continue to swing, but you still have for the most part, that same system in place. So, you know, it took, what, 50 years to build it, right? So there's, before even sort of the civil rights movement, the radical, you know, movements of the late 50s, 60s, it took a long time, sort of this counter-revolution to the revolution, to build an entire system of policing and mass incarceration that it's going to take a long time to sort of decrease the collateral effects of it. You know, and then like right now, in some areas, there's even more punitive. I was in Sacramento and the youth were talking about Task Force Tuesday, but they call it Terror Tuesday, because on Tuesdays they know the task force is going to set up and frisk them all right after school. so they all hide. Terror Tuesday. So, you know, there's practices everywhere, I think, that are continuing to be just as punitive as before.
Other questions?
Can I ask a question? Yeah.
After.
My-
Okay, go ahead,
Sorry.
Christine.
My question's for Genevieve. Genevieve, you studied undocumented students here at Berkeley and the organizing that they did around the issues that they faced, which made a huge, huge difference. Are you seeing any of that as well? I mean, the story that you told is incredibly terrible, but I'm wondering if there are rays of hope as well of the students organizing, or is it different?
Yeah, I only had 15 minutes, so I felt like the more important story to tell was the story about neoliberalism, and the story about the reality that things are still bad, because what I'm confronting often is that people think that we're done. Not the students. The students know that we're not done. But there's a lot of people who say, well, there's been a lot of movement on the ground, like there's these new laws, there's these new policies. Things are good now for undocumented students, right? And that's not the reality. That's not the reality at all. And so that's why I chose to sort of focus in on this. And it's really the question that you ask. So is there hope? Absolutely. Are the students in the Central Valley fighting back? Absolutely. Are they being ignored? Absolutely. And I think there's a lot of reasons that that's happening. I think that the particular sort of political geography of the Central Valley raises a certain set of very particular questions. And the grassroots movement on the ground there it's amazing. I mean, there are students, some of you may have seen right before Christmas, just last year, students, undocumented students got up on ladders, big tall ladders in front of the ICE buildings. I don't know if anybody, I'm not seeing much nodding, so maybe nobody saw this because we're not really paying attention to what's happening in Fresno. But there was this big, huge event, and I spoke to several of the young women who were involved in pulling that off, and they had very little training, they had very little resources, they had actually very little sense of the risks involved, because so much of the work that they're doing in the Valley is untouched by the massive sort of bubbling up of support that we're seeing in the LA area and in the Bay Area. So is there resistance? Absolutely, because there's always resistance. And part of what ignited this set of inquiries in the first place was that I really was wondering, I really didn't have a sense about how widespread these shifts in policies, how they were impacting what was happening on the ground. And so of course there's a risk in telling the story that I told today, which is that you could assume that, well, these kinds of policies aren't really important, right? It's not true. They're critically important. It's so important that what's happened has happened, and it's not the politicians who got that stuff passed, it's the students who got that stuff passed. At the same time, there is this risk, it's like the Obama effect, right? There is this risk in thinking that we've done the work that needs to be done, and we have not done anywhere close to work that needs to be done. And as soon as you step into the Valley, that becomes really, really abundantly clear.
I guess I had a follow-up question to that. Your ethnography was amazing and so moving, and what I love about it is that you, in framing it in terms of neoliberalism, you are subverting the logic of neoliberalism in that you see these kids who are pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, which is what you're supposed to do as a good neoliberal citizen, and they can't make it because that same system is pushing that back down. And I wonder if you could speak to how, since this is in some ways a conference about engaged research and breaking the barriers from academia into the community, how you're thinking about taking this ethnography and changing the narrative around the dreamers and around what it means to be an undocumented student.
Yeah, so, so I have a couple of responses to that. So one is that I'm trying to be a good Marxist. I try and be a good social change scholar. So I'm always thinking about these questions, sort of how does class manifest here? What is the gendered story here? What are the stories of resistance here? I'm always trying to think about these questions. But I think a lot about neoliberalism, like my spare time, but I really didn't go in there looking for neoliberalism. And as soon as I started talking to these young people, I mean, it was just everywhere. The neoliberal story was so profound and it was so loud that there was no way that I couldn't hear it. And so in some ways, it's a story that presented itself to me. And so, as researchers, I think we have a choice that we either listen or we don't when the story opens itself up to us. In terms of the question about how I'm thinking of using this research to sort of subvert the dominant dreamer narrative, it's really, really important to me to make clear that I am taking the lead from the students in this, right? The fact that I was even thinking about these questions in the first place is because the students themselves, the undocumented youth activists themselves, have been pushing back against that narrative. And I'm not talking about the ones who are left out only, right? I'm talking about the ones who are at UC Berkeley, the ones who are at UCLA, the ones who are at Harvard and Yale and Columbia, are the ones who have been saying, in large part, look, I don't want a DREAM Act if it is going to leave my parents behind. I don't want a kind of amnesty that's going to be built on the backs of other migrants, right? And they've been saying that for a long, long time. And it hasn't made it into the national media, not because they haven't been saying it, but because they are, their voices are being squashed by big DC politics and the big national immigrant rights groups who are putting out that line and saying, these kids were brought here against their will because of their criminal parents, essentially. That's not a direct quote, but it might as well be, right? So, in terms of how I'm thinking about using this is research that's still very much underway. I'm still doing these interviews. I'm still working with these young people. I'm walking a balance between, I don't want to be the sort of, smarty pants, like, what you should really do is, and at the same time wanting to be very supportive of the work that they're doing, wanting to be able to connect them to the folks who are doing the work in different parts of the state and the places where those connections don't exist. At the same time, wanting to really be very clear that my role as a researcher, even as an activist researcher, is one that requires me to sit back and listen and not one to sort of step out and say, this is what you should really do, this is who you should really be talking to, this is what you should really be thinking about. And so it's a constant ongoing process, walking that balance between figuring out how to be helpful and how to be useful and wanting to be helpful and useful there, but then also wanting to be very clear to them, but more broadly, I'm not steering this thing, right? That this is, I am the student in this space. I am the learner, and I'm learning from the work that they're doing. And even the set of questions that came up in the first place is because they were pushing back on this narrative, basically from the very beginning.
Wait till you get the mic. Just wait till you get the mic.
Case as being instructive. It's like a total assault upon the educational institutions at all levels in the name of neoliberalism. So, yeah, there's a line by the dream, there's a line by the water fountain, there's a line out the door. And we see now, like, they're talking about shutting down campuses, they're laying off all the full-time faculty, and then they've taken over elements of the WASC, Western Association of School of Colleges accreditation program, along with an agenda defined partly by Broad Foundation and by Gates Foundation, talking about professionalization. So they take the A to G, talk about everything should lead somewhere, even though it's probably leading to 20 years ago. And among a population that isn't necessarily going to have every day money and attendance. So there's a restriction of support. There's an elimination of full-time faculty. There's a reduction of the ability to offer courses, the non-repeatability rule. Did they talk about that one? No. And so the effect of it is a tremendous contraction, strongest at the community colleges, then also at the state universities. So it's like what you're seeing particularly hits the population, but if they're an eye into the rest of it, it seems like it would be interesting to see how their circumstances articulate with this broader effect of neoliberalism on the way they're doing housekeeping, funding, and course offerings at the junior colleges. What do you think?
I don't think there was a question in that, Minkus, but yes. Yes, you're absolutely correct. And there's a lot of people who are writing about this and thinking about this. I mean, you know, Giroux is particularly prolific in terms of this conversation, but there's a lot of people thinking and writing about this at various scales. And it's, of course, not just happening in California, right? It's happening nationally. There's bits of neoliberalism in every single one of these stories here, right? It's not just happening in education. It's happening in the works. It's happening in the workplace. It's happening in the streets. It's everywhere, absolutely. And I think that for me, the choice to look at the community college system is exactly came from what you're talking about, right? Is that it's oftentimes that there's a certain audience for this story when we talk about what's happening in terms of neoliberalism at UC Berkeley, and it's important what is happening here. It's critically important, right? This is a critically, fundamentally important critical space of public, right, in the state of California. At the same time, there is more of an audience to listen to what's happening in terms of the impacts of neoliberalism in a flagship state, prestigious R1 than there is at a rinky-dinky little community college that people have never, in a city that people have never heard of, right? And so it's, and I'm not setting that up to say, well, you know, this shouldn't be as important, this should be more important, but to say we need to build the connective threads, because when you take a step back and look, it's happening everywhere, and the connective threads are all there.
Victor. So your work, of course, is so important, particularly at this time when part of the reaction to widespread unemployment, which is all part of the economic restructuring, and today's current manifestation of where we are in the logic of capital accumulation, neoliberalism being the term that we give to this stage. But we know that part of that has been this widespread of unemployment, and that along with that has been both the sort of prison industrial complex as well as the prison nation and the ideologies that sustain that prison nation. So young men of color and the way they're treated in this, of course, is very much, it's very tragic, right, to sort of see the way it gets played out. And I know you have very intimate knowledge and as well as the research experience of that. Part of what I'm interested in hearing you reflect more on, because I could hear you talk for a long time, and we've had lots of conversations about how to take, well, not lots, but we're beginning lots, we've had some, on how to take some of your work and extend it into the policy arena, particularly when we look across state policies and the work of ALEC, for example, and how they try to get minimum mandatory sentencing and 3 strikes you're out, and all the ways in which policies get played out, right, to reinforce these kinds of things and make our folks be the victims of that. Part of what I'm interested in hearing you speak more about, besides commenting on any of that, is how you see some of the gendered ways in which this gets, how this gets played out with respect to women. So, you know, as part of the young men's search for dignity, as you say, it's not honor and respect, but it's a search for dignity. We know that in the past, a lot of time, men's search for dignity has been at the expense of women. And so I'm wondering, because part of the men's empowerment is also the empowerment of their community and the women in their community. So while there's respect for mothers, for example, there's respect for women, there's also challenges to how the masculinity gets challenged and played out. So anything you can just say about the relations of the young men to the women, and maybe even more, and about the women themselves.
Yeah, so thank you for your questions. I'll address the gender question. So I went out, I actually started interviewing for the Oakland study, young women, started preliminary observations, and then I came back and was, you know, in grad courses, conversation with people, and I realized that I wasn't being reflexive, right, that their experiences were being spoken about in the same ways that other theorists had spoken about the experience of women, which feminist criminologists called the stag effect. And the stag effect is pretty much that theories of delinquency have actually been studies of boys that then get sort of blanketed over the experiences of women. And so I at the time decided that it would be more important to study the masculinity factor. So I have a chapter in Punished about this perilous masculinity that in empowering themselves, right, sort of through hypermasculinity, they definitely disempower or are aggressive towards or abuse the women in their lives. And I talk about also how young women end up picking up certain forms of hypermasculinity and end up, like one of the young ladies in the book is fist fighting, other guys to prove herself on the street. Unfortunately, I definitely decided that I wanted to focus on the males to really uncover the gender process that takes place with the males, which then, by default, I ended up leaving out the women. So that's definitely an important, yeah. And then also, I have a couple papers coming out on this whole sort of, I call it the mechanics of manhood, and I talk about how masculinity is also very fluid. So on any given day, crossing different institutional settings, a very hypermasculine guy can actually be also, like right now the big trend, I've seen it in Oakland, I've seen it in Watts, where some of my new research in this past summer started, seen it in the Central Coast, where a lot of the boys are pushing their children around in strollers. I'm talking about boys that are putting in work on the street corners, pushing their children around, taking care of them, feeding them, changing their diaper, something that 10 years ago wasn't happening. So masculinity not only has changed over time, but it changes on a daily basis, and that has to do with that cultural heterogeneity that exists out there that we've been kind of blind to as scholars. Policy-wise, I would love to participate in those conversations. I think that there's a great grassroots organization here in Oakland called Courage, Communities United for Restorative Justice, and they've been connecting with the Boys and Men of Color Initiative, and they've been advocating for all these policies to change kind of on a quarterly basis and really pushing for, and then they highlight all the policies that they've been pushing for. Unfortunately, I haven't really been involved in those sort of political, public policy spaces I would like to be.
I have a question for Jennifer. Jennifer, your second point on intersectionality and as a method for social change. I always thought of intersectionality as referring to like multiple identities that we have or the multiple locations that we inhabit, and I wasn't clear how you were using it in your presentation.
Yes, I think certainly the body of scholarship on intersectionality has a really kind of long history, and there have been many debates. And I think partly what kind of thinking about intersectionality not just as the kind of a kind of multiple and additive understanding of identities, but to actually see intersectionality as an optic on power. And so that's one of the things that AWA tries to do is, certainly Asian immigrant women workers in garment shops or as home care workers really do experience kind of multiple levels of oppression, but also have multiple sets of commitments as mothers, as wives, as workers, as kind of members of their community. But I think rather than see all of those different dimensions as features of their identities, I think what AWA tries to do is see all of these different dimensions and say, if we really understand how they intersect and overlap and are co-constitutive at different moments, then it gives us an optic to see how power actually operates at a very everyday dimension of people's lives. So for example, one of the first things that we found was that when women started to take time out to go to English language classes, it's a kind of popular education approach to workplace literacy classes, it actually started to reconfigure the power relations in the household and in the family. It also started to affect their relationships with their children, so that their children would no longer, for example, see them as kind of victimized or monolingual or people who had nothing to contribute, but they saw them as kind of taking a proactive step in really trying to improve the conditions of their lives. And so what was really interesting was that this decision to think about what it meant to be monolingual or to take an English class actually had a ripple effect in terms of the kind of relationships that immigrant women might have with their children in an English-only kind of world where their children have to be interpreters, things like that. And so, the paper that is about this particular framework really says we need to go beyond this kind of multiple identity additive approach and really see how social movement organizations think through and actually apply what it means to kind of challenge intersectionality.
Any other questions?
How you doing? My question is, because I've been doing some reflecting in terms of different speakers and the whole theme of breaking barriers, building communities. But how is it that we're, in a sense, breaking these barriers, building communities, but in a sense, we still have like a very academic perspective, and in terms of like, how do we take these type of scenes, not just like in away from Berkeley and more into Oakland, more into Richmond, more, but even in a sense like into like prisons, into like juvenile halls, and how do we, as audience and speakers, like have more youth engagement in the things we're saying, And I don't know if my question might hear anything. Hopefully it did.
I would say that one of the things that I feel really indebted to ISSC for is that I have always thought about my academic work and my research work as an extension of my political work. And I felt like in a lot of places in the academy, I had to either pretend like that wasn't the case, or I had to fight to be able to have that seen as legitimate. And in coming to ISSC, one of the things that shaped me really profoundly as a thinker was being in a place where I didn't have to pretend like that wasn't the case, didn't have to sort of dumb down the politics in order to sort of hype up the research stuff, but being in a place where those things were seen as, where it was not only okay that those things inhabited the same space, but that it was a mandate, right? That to a certain extent, all research should be asking that question, right? Not just social change research. That all researchers, that all intellectuals, that all academics should be thinking, how is it that I am measuring my work, not just based on how many citations I get in the whatever that thing's called, citational index or whatever, but how am I measuring my work in the ways that I'm shifting the public conversation about migration, about migrant workers, about illegality, about policing, right? That these are the kinds of questions we should be asking ourselves as thinkers. And so the question that I hear and the question that you're asking is sort of embedded in that conversation, right? Is that how is it that we contribute to a kind of public scholarship? How is it that we nurture ourselves as public scholars? How is it that we encourage a kind of public scholarship within each other and within the academy, that all of us are held to the kind of standards that says that the measure of our work is not these traditional markers around citations, but the measure of our work is how much it is rooted in, grounded in, shifting the work that's happening on the ground.
So, yeah, I always had that debate from when I started grad school. When I applied to grad school, I told them I wanted to be a community organizer. And then I got here, and people laughed at me like, that's not what you're here for. You're here to become a scholar. And I never compromised. I never said, I'm going to be, now I'm a scholar, right? I mean, I get paid to be a scholar, and so, but I still do my part, right, my piece, and at the end of the day, that's what I can be comfortable with. This morning I was at UC Davis, 1,000 high school students, talking to them, in sort of a different format, right? Tomorrow I'll be in Oakland talking at a community event. So, you do what you can because that's your commitment as an individual. And, I wrote Punish. I took it to the streets of Oakland, took it to one of the boys. He looked at it. I said, give me your feedback and be honest. And he looked at it. I came back later. He says, it's all right. But it don't speak to me. And when he said that to me, man, my heart sank. Because I had spent a lot of time wanting to speak, not just for, not just about, but with the people I was studying. So I lost a lot of sleep. And over time I realized, well, you know, maybe I should write something, you know, for them at their level. And I ended up writing, I consider a real sort of silly book, but the kids, they read it, and it's got a sociological imagination, it's got a critical sort of, you know, for me, right, a critical philosophical way of telling these stories, but the youth are connecting with it at continuation schools and some of the youth facilities I've been to. And then I brought that same book, the other book, it's called Street Life, it's posted over there. I brought it to the youth in Oakland, and then I said, hey, same guy, right? I'm like, read this one, what do you think? And he said, it's all right. But this time around, he didn't say it, didn't speak to him. And how I know he liked it is because all his homies started asking me for copies. But they didn't want copies of Punished, right? They wanted copies of Street Life. So what does that mean, right? That sometimes, but I don't put that on my CV. Because I don't want my colleagues to say, well, that's not an academic piece. He shouldn't be putting it on his CV or whatever it is that they're going to say, right? And so I just do it because that's my commitment. And so you got to ask yourself, what's your commitment? You know, because sometimes, you know, to create knowledge, right, you have to commit yourself to a certain way of being, but you don't necessarily have to compromise.
Maybe what I'll just add to the conversation is that I think when you try to do research that matters, it requires multiple strategies. And I think for me, a real humility. I think one thing that's been clear to me is that kind of developing a relationship with a community organization and being open to allowing a community to define where your research needs to go is a really kind of humbling thing, and that there may be kind of parallel things going on at different moments. And, you know, so one thing that, you know, I sort of feel like I'm at a place where I've shared a lot of this research with AWA and with its allies, and so I'm trying to write some journal articles about it, but of course encountering the you're biased problem and the core discomfort with this kind of research, but then also moving on with the organization and continuing to do research that they think is important. And I think in particular, for example, like the organization wants to understand home care. All of the former garment workers are now home care workers, and it's an entirely different industry to organize. And this isn't necessarily something that I have expertise in, but you can actually connect organizations to other researchers. So I do think that there are multiple ways to think about engagement and a certain kind of transformational research practice.
Any other questions? Well, if not, well, before I make a few closing remarks, I want to have a round of applause for our wonderful panelists. And I just wanted to make a few brief closing remarks about the Institute. I served as the director here from 2003 to 2008, and Troy's wonderful history this morning kind of cut off at 1998. So I wanted to talk a little bit about life after Troy Duster. So I arrived in 2003, and it had been about 5 years since you were the director, but some momentous things had happened in those 5 years, because there were 2 Regents resolutions that had been passed, as well as Proposition 209, which banned affirmative action at all of the University of California campuses, as well as all other state colleges and universities. And this had transformed the landscape of the student body relatively quickly, because students come and go. They disappear and they can be repopulated. And so when I arrived, as Troy had told me graciously over lunch, this was the only organized research unit on the campus devoted to diversity. And there was a kind of an identity crisis, because the question was, how can you have an organized research unit devoted to diversity on a campus where the people have spoken and said there will be no more affirmative action? So my task really was to come through that identity crisis and make this an even stronger institution, because the truth was it was more needed than ever at that moment. And so I entered, and just to paraphrase Gramsci, with the pessimism of my intelligence, but the optimism of my will. And so the first thing that I decided was that we really had to have 3 core activities, one of which was our research. Because at times of controversy, of backlash, of deep and intense disagreement over values, research is very important, because it can inform debates, it can help each side understand better the points of the other. And so we had a remarkable research history, and we were able to focus on youth in our research grants and to do things on digital youth, because we knew that the internet and other digital technologies were really changing the way that youth approach information. We were able to do a youth violence prevention project, which, as I mentioned, Victor participated in. And we were able to do a project on mixed status families and immigrant youth and their attachment to the nation in a family where one member might be a citizen, one might be eligible for citizenship, and one might be undocumented. And so that research was a wonderful source of generative discussion and dialogue, and we brought in faculty and graduate students and undergraduate students in conjunction with that activity. But it was also critical, in addition to doing research that would have impact right now, to also build the leadership of the future. And that is why I really believe that the graduate training program was the heart and soul of the Institute during my time here. Now, because we no longer had affirmative action, we had to figure out how to create a critical mass of emerging young scholars at the Institute at a time when they were dispersed and isolated in their departments. And so we created a competitive process. It was deeply interdisciplinary. We increased the stipends, which was nice. We made it a 2-year program, and we integrated into it a requirement that you do a paper, and then we posted it on our new website, which we created at that time, and I'll get to that in a moment, which it turned out had downloads from all over the world. This research is not just interesting to you sitting here today or to the people who did it. It's interesting to scholars around the world. And so, as a result, we were able to create that critical mass of interdisciplinary scholars talking across their disciplines, but they all knew that the subject matter of diversity was presumptively legitimate. And that allowed very, very formative conversations. I was so pleased I got a list of everyone who's gone through the program to see the tremendously successful placement of these graduate students. And the other thing that we did in the program, knowing how isolated people were in their departments, is that we said your research is the center of this graduate research training. It is your voice that we must nurture, that we must hone and refine. We don't want you off doing other things, being somebody's research assistant or teaching assistant. We want this to be the core of what you do here, so you have a strong and vibrant identity as you leave this safe space. Now, the other thing that we thought was tremendously important was to have a very visible face, to have outreach and community building beyond the walls of the academy, which was in some ways the subject of the last question. I was very fortunate to be able to have Bob Yamashita come in and talk to me about creating a prize that would recognize young activists, young people in the community who were making a tremendous difference, so that we could send a signal that this was not purely academic, that activism is legitimate. And to hear today Sarah Ramirez feel so affirmed by that prize, to know that that prize is still there, to know that we will be about 8 years of cohorts now with the prize, including those fabulous runners-up, it was always so hard to decide, means that we have built a critical mass now of people out in the community who have that signal of their excellence, to embolden them, to help them, to gain the legitimacy and credibility that they need to do that important work. We also have wonderful programming like this, and we're thrilled that we've built a constituency over the years for our programming, and we also launched a new website at the time, which helps to, I think, inform an entire globe about what goes on here, because this is seminal work in many, many ways. Now, the truth is, when you come in as a director, you can't do it alone. And I certainly know this as dean now, but you have to have a community of people who will pull with you, who share your sense of optimism about the possibilities for change. And so as I come back today, one of the things that I'm so thrilled about is people who were involved when I was here are still here. And I want to actually, recognize folks who are here for just a minute. So I'd like everybody, I know Janice is here, Janice Tanagawa, of course. Janice welcomed me when I first arrived and helped me to do some of the refurbishing of the facilities. We had to be very creative with our budget, but Janice is nothing if not resourceful as we transformed the face of the Institute. Also David Minkus. I don't know how come everybody's calling him David now, because we always called him Minkus, so something has happened since I've been gone. But he was here to share with me the history of the Institute. Troy was very gracious in advising me about the Institute and what it had done. I also was able to bring in some tremendous talent. I'm actually really proud of Christine Trost. And also Deborah Lustig. These are both my hires. I love that. But we also had a great faculty advisory board. We've had wonderful students. We've had community members. We've had partners around the campus. And I just thought it would be wonderful as an exercise to have people who were leaders or staff members at the Institute stand up, including the chairs. I know you're back there, David. Patricia Baquedano Lopez is here. So please stand up. This is an exercise. Troy, David, Deborah, Christine, Janice. Stand up, please. And also our affiliated faculty. Freed, I know, is here. There are others. All the people who were graduate fellows, please stand up if you were a graduate fellow while you were here. Please stand up if you've ever partnered with us or come to a prior program of the Institute. Please stand up. We really, really appreciate that ongoing support. You're what sustained the Institute. All of you here today are tremendously important to our future, and people have talked a lot about the pain of social change. Let me tell you that the process can be joyous. And I had the privilege of that joyous experience for 5 years. And I hope that you will share with me the sense of continued possibility and promise as we move forward. And I felt the only thing I regretted is that I didn't have enough of a chance to hear from you today about your remembrances of the Institute. So I thought I would close very briefly. We have a few minutes, and I thank Christine for not putting me between you and a reception. If any of you would like to share any reminiscences of the Institute in your time here before we close. Anybody? Because we heard from all the people, but I know there are many, many people out there with wonderful memories. And I know Kay, for example, worked with me on a fabulous singles project. But please, I hope you'll share those memories if you want to share them informally afterwards. But truly, this is a celebration, and it's a celebration of all of you. Thank you.